Greetings from the University of Notre Dame Press. I'm Catherine Pitts, the Marketing and Publicity Director at the Press. We are so excited today to be here with our Books for Better Understanding author event series and the AWP Conference and Book Fair, which is going to be held virtually this year on March 3 through 7. Today's featured author is Rosemarie Kinder, whose book, A Common Person and Other Stories, is the winner of the Richard Sullivan Prize in Short Fiction and was published by Notre Dame Press on February 1, 2021. Rosemarie will be talking with Valerie Sayers, who is editor of the Sullivan Prize series, sponsored by the Creative Writing Department in the English department at the University of Notre Dame. I'd like to start by introducing Rosemarie Kinder.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for being here. Rosemarie is the author of 3 prize-winning collections of short fiction, including A Near Perfect Gift, which is the winner of the University of Michigan Literary Fiction Award, and Sweet Angel Band and Other Stories, winner of the Helicon 9 Editions Willa Cather Fiction Prize. She has also published 2 novels, An Absolute Gentleman and The Universe Playing Strings. Her prose has appeared in Passages North, Other Voices, North American Review, The New York Times, and elsewhere. Valerie Sayers is the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of English at the University of Notre Dame. She is the author of a collection of stories, The Age of Infidelity, and 6 novels. Thank you both for agreeing to talk about Rosemarie's book today. Now I'll turn things over to Valerie.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Rosemarie, it's just a pleasure to be here with you. I have to say, very often when reading a collection of stories, you feel as if you're getting to know a writer. But with your collection, every story sent me in a new direction. So I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about how the collection came together. It has so many different voices speaking, such a range of subject matter and approaches, and yet there's a common sensibility there. I see it throughout each story. So how did you decide to pull these stories together into a collection?
Well, I'm very glad that you see that there's a sensibility that is in control here, because, or at least present throughout. My stories are sort of prompted by something rather than my have an organizing principle or something that I go out and I seek. I see things that prompt my interest, and so I write about them. And I've done that when I was a young girl, of course. It was in poems and little skits and anecdotes and ballads. But by the time I started writing formally and studying writing, I had already these patterns going, and as also had 2 landscapes behind me, because I had been raised in Southeast Missouri with superstitions, poverty, violence, just everything in a small town down near the Boot Heel. And then I had moved to Arizona, open skies, open people, more fluid life. And I love both of them. And so you put all of these things together, and the fact that I was learning to write formally, that's what happened. I found I'd have an idea for a story, and then the method would come to me, or the approach, whether it was going to be the group voice, which I love, or an individual voice. Does that answer you?
It does. And it's as I would say to my students, and that's the right answer, because I think the best stories do have that organic feel of being created for the purposes of the story, that the form and the subject matter are in some way inseparable. And I certainly feel that in each of your stories.
Thank you.
But that leads me to the next question, which is about your subjects, which are often so difficult and even provocative. The story that opens the collection is just a wondrous inhabitation of the mind of a woman who is at once being violated by authorities who are coming to take her away for questioning, and who is also just gutsy about retrieving her belongings, which are, in this case, guns. It's a really interesting story to be thinking about in this moment, in our moment, when guns and gun violence are so much on our minds. But what's most wondrous to me about that story and about all your stories is the way you create a language for them that's deeply pleasurable, even as they're difficult, even if you're talking about rape or abortion or any subject that's ordinarily difficult and hits all kinds of nerves and readers. You're creating this beautiful language to talk about them. So I have a little tiny passage, if you'll indulge me. I just want to read this because I think it's so beautiful and so
Thank you.
typical of what you do. It's from this first story. Outside their vehicle, other cars held people, and people walked here and there, waited at a bus stop. Geese were on a green bank by a channel. Clouds were flat bottomed, billow topped, fantastical structures. And the moon, that transparent gray gauze, was visible in daytime. Not possible. A universe with billions of galaxies, an earth with billions of fossils from billions of years, monsters and miracles. It was a dream world. She had never lived at all, scurrying from nightmare to nightmare, an eternity of ignorant coming into being, a swarm of such beings. So I read a paragraph like that and I find my hand marking the beat. I know you're a musician as well as a writer. So will you talk a little bit about how you find the music of a story, especially when it's about a difficult subject?
I love your analysis and what you chose to read and the way you read it and the question. I'm very happy to answer it. I never thought that I had any beauty in my writing. And so, I mean, I've been told that every now and then, but my writing is so plain to me that it's hard for me to see that. So I love to hear it. But yes, when I'm writing a story, I feel like, well, there's a saying fiddlers have that if you get the right key for a song, it will lie under your fingers on the fiddle. I mean, if it's the right key, it's going to be easy to play in that key. That's what it's meant to be. And I think that's true of stories, although I didn't know that when I was writing, that was a saying. But you'll try a story and it won't work, or the language will get cumbersome, or it's a struggle to tell that story. Well, then the language is wrong. The approach is wrong. Something's wrong. And so if that happens, I'll stop. I'm not thinking of it in terms of music. I'm thinking of it in terms of the language of the story. But when I do hit a rough spot, or at the end, when I have finished the story, I do think about rhythm. I go back and I read it aloud to myself. And when I have a troubled passage, I'll read it over and over. And sometimes one of my problems is alliteration. I get so carried away with sound that I obscure the meaning. And then it's a choice, cut it out, cut it out. And so, yes, I think if I'm not careful, I would speak, write, walk in iambic pentameter. That's what I think.
I think David Mamet says we do think, walk, and talk in iambic
It's the English language meters, I feel like, you know.
Right.
But thank you very much for that question.
Oh, my pleasure, because the language really is a pleasure. And I do believe that it's often a much braver choice by a writer to go plain than to frill it up. You know, clarity is such a gift to us all. But I also wanted to ask you about realism, because most of your stories, I think, would the very term realism is a tricky one, and it covers a whole lot of territory. But I think most of your stories could fairly be called realist. but there are a couple that just, maybe right outside the bounds of realism, and a couple that really seem, yes, they have left the zone of realism and they're now in another zone, whether that's a fable or a kind of fevered imagination or a folk tale. So how do you decide? And what are your feelings about that term realism? And is that adequate to describe a lot of your work?
Yes, and I do think that I'm a realistic writer. I am interested in fantasy and I'm interested in magic realism, but I am not, and my talent and my eye, my everything is realistic, and I can't get enough fantastical to make that leap. It takes a real talent. But to me, what looks like fantasy or surrealism is realism in the mind of that character. I mean, if it's the motivation, if I can't explain the motivation or the action or the thought of a character in my terms of realism, because that's not their world, I have to enter their mind for that kind of realism. So for example, Alvy and the Rapist, which is one and strange, the way that the rapist sees Alvy as a prey is his particular fantasy, not mine. Mine realistically trying to show how this kind of mind thinks, and it's his reality. And his victim has an entirely different reality in which she's no victim, but he doesn't know that. And so to me, that story is realistic in that I am presenting the aberrant mind. It's realistic that way. It makes me think of, well, it's not exactly a good analogy. Henry James Turner, the Screw, where you're not sure whether or not she's seeing real ghosts or whether or not she's crazy, and they're not. And you can't decide, But that is one. And the other one, would it be Mother Post?
Mother Post, yes.
Well, I think Mother Post is a good example of realism given today's times. How something happens that scares people or they're afraid of it. It's just outside the norm of their culture. It shouldn't have happened. Then you start hearing about that kind of thing. Well, it happened over in Benton too, and so found a razor blade in her mail. You know what? I just read a story. I don't know if I can say this on this recording. I just read a story in the New Yorker last night or the night before somewhere about a young girl that wanted to entice her lover to bind him, and she used an old-fashioned method with menstrual blood. It's that kind of thing. Now, if you heard about that in real life, would you think anybody really did that? No, you see what I mean? So, well, it is not fantasy. It is a realistic depiction of a small town community that has something going on that's strange and what they do with it. Does that answer?
Good answer. Good answer. Excellent.
Did I cross the bounds of propriety? In the New Yorker.
Are there bounds of propriety? It was an excellent answer. And I have to catch up with you in my New Yorkers. I'm always about 6 months behind.
There was a woman, I can't remember, think of her name, but it was very odd. Go ahead.
Well, actually that's a good segue to the next question, which is about violence. And we've already talked about that a little bit, especially in Alvy and the Rapist, which is, such a wonderful immersion into two distorted sets of perceptions. Alvy's a really magnificent character, but clearly troubled. And the Rapist, of course, is the opposite of a magnificent character. So there's this wonderful double-sided exploration of violence. In many of the stories, you just hit the violence straight on. People's anger boils to the point where they feel absolutely driven to violence. And there's even a young man who says, let me get the exact quote, "I enjoy restrained, necessary violence." He's such an admirable character in the story, and that line just pops out as such an interesting way to phrase a relationship to violence, to have an idea about violence that is that coherent and cohesive. But of course, it must be difficult to write about violence, to confront it over and over again, and I'm sure that it's clear from the stories themselves that you have really thought about the ways that writers can ethically portray a kind of violence that is deplorable, but you've made it in some way understandable because we've come to inhabit these characters. So could you talk a little bit about your relationship to violence and the writing of it?
Right. I have experienced a lot of violence in my life, and I mean, as far as not myself being threatened or hurt or anything like that, but having been raised, as I said, in the small town where I was, and the kinds of families that I happened to know. My husband was a policeman. The father of my daughters worked in the rape detail and also in homicide.
Mm.
So, and I've also researched this kind of thing, but what there's, it's a complex question in a way, but also very easy to answer. I believe in ethical fiction. And so I never want to write about violence in a way that panders to the wrong kind of taste, that descends, that incites something. I don't want to do that. I don't want to play to base urges. And I also don't want to dwell on it too much. I don't want to get it in my mind. I don't want too many graphic pictures or anything. So I try never to go across a certain line. And it's just by feel. I don't want to go there. I don't want to say that. And so that's that kind of violence. But that's why I don't ever describe anything very much, but I will describe the angst of it. And that's because we are all under pressure. Every human being is under pressure at some time, and it has a fear of loss of place, loss of identity, loss of safety, food, something, or loss of being able to do something you really wanted to do to help somebody and you couldn't do it. That kind of stress, if it goes on long enough and then deep enough, it's going to cause violence against self or somebody else. I think that that's just true of maybe any creature. But I think you particularly see it today. And so I think I'm writing about violence almost every story I write, but I don't want it to be the dominant part of life. It's one thing, and it can be seen and controlled. And when that young man said, I think that was in Brute, he's a hunter, So he's a hunter, or he at least has dogs that go hunting. I didn't see him shoot anyone or anything. But I can see there are people who enjoy violence like boxing, sports. They like to see it, but there are rules to that. And that is getting to be violent safely, restrained, or maybe necessary to protect yourself. But going beyond that, when you make a choice to go beyond that, choice, violence for violence. No, I don't want it in my fiction.
Mm.
Did I get too heavy-handed? I feel like I was
No,
preaching.
no. It's such a present thread. It is interesting to think about how you approach that. As you said, you grew up with a lot of violence. I think probably every American
Everyone.
could say we've grown up with a lot of violence, even if it's indirect. And
Mhm.
so I think that question for the writer becomes a crucial one. How do we portray this in a way that honors the reality of its presence in our lives, but doesn't, as you say, indulge it.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a good word. You don't indulge. No.
so
You don't further it in any way.
That's right. And you mentioned that it is not just humans, but creatures who are inclined to violence. And of course, one of the major motifs of this collection of stories is animals, in particular dogs, but not just dogs, but animals are so present. And in fact, they're so present that, the occasional story without animals seems, I miss them. They are, we realize that in writers who use animals so thoughtfully, they become crucial in a way that underscores how crucial they are to our understanding of this universe we live in. So please talk about animals. It's really clear you have a long relationship with them. You have a lot of authority when you talk about the animals themselves, about their training, about their frustrations, about their violence. All those things are just made so visceral and delightful in so many cases.
Oh, good. Well, again, that's a question I would love to answer. I did not know that, honestly, I did not know how many animals appeared in this collection until I really started reading the collection. I know that I write about animals because I write about them the way they are in our lives. I mean, I don't remember living anywhere where animals weren't part of the neighborhood or somebody's family, even if I didn't have one. And when I was a girl, we couldn't have animals because my sister was allergic to animals, but everybody had them and you're aware of them. They're just part of the neighborhood. I remember that makes me think of something I hadn't thought of in years. My mother said once that you can tell when you walk outside if there's a new dog in town. Now, I don't think she meant really maybe a canine, but I just thought of that and I'm doing, so I said that. But animals are in our lives. But when I write about them, I don't want to preach. I don't want to sermonize. I'm not trying to tell people this is animal abuse, even if it is. I don't want that to be heavy. So I don't want to be sermonizing. I want there to be a purpose in the story other than the animal. And the same thing when I don't want, although I love them, I don't want to I don't want it to be too sentimental. There's got to be a truth I'm getting at, something about the community, the family, something. And the dog is part of that family and part of that community. And it happens to be, he's the one that's getting abused. And so people have to do something about it, just like if it was a woman or something. And so, but I don't want to write just to feel good or sentimental. I think animals rather, not dogs. I like to think of them as personalities instead of animals, but they're worth of their own story, but
Yeah,
that's not what I'm doing. But I don't see how people can live without animals, birds, something, you know.
I
Did
can
I answer, Valerie?
Yes, and I can absolutely affirm that there is nothing sentimental about your treatment of animals. I am very glad to say that because there's something tough in the way you write about them because it's parallel to the way you write about people, and because so often if an animal is being abused, and that is of course hard to write about even if you don't go into great detail, but it's parallel to the way that humans are abused periodically throughout the collection. And it's also the other parallel you provide is the way that both animals and humans are able to get out of that situation. So I did want to ask you, there's just a wonderful collection of self-sufficient women in this story. And one thing I like about the way you approach their self-sufficiency is how doubt-riddled they all are. You know, they are ultimately these real tough dames. But talk about not sentimentalizing them or not mythologizing them. They're all full of doubt and fear, and you know, there is just a wonderful sense of roundness to female characters in particular. But you also allow male characters plenty of weakness. I'm interested in in whether you consciously approach gender, or whether that's simply a function of such intense observation of individuals.
Um, I don't think that I have to tell you, I always admire women. I mean, I don't think I'm an ardent feminist in any way. I like men too. It's not that, but I think women have, because of their history of being the one that was the weakest and the mother and the one that had to plan long term, stay alive long enough to raise that baby, that kind of thing, that there is in me a feeling that women have an endurance that is just part of being female, that they can endure all sorts of things. But I don't, when I'm writing, think so much of gender. I think of the person. And I think I even like reading stories where, I don't know how to diverge here. I'll just say this, the story, the literature that I have focused on the most, that I have attended the most in my life and gained the most from, almost every time the characters in the story were confined by a gender role when their nature didn't fit it or their situation didn't fit it. And that's the stories that I'm drawn to the most. And since I taught women's literature, and since I am a woman, and I love Willa Cather too, I mean, a lot of women writers, what I would see is that often the woman had to take the man's role.
Mm.
And often the man who should have been the provider couldn't have been, or he was a caretaking. So I became very aware that the gender roles is secondary to the character. You know, Sherwood Anderson's Wing Biddlebaum,
Mm.
a more loving, caretaking, sweet man there, but he didn't fit, he fit a different definition than he was supposed to. And so he was ostracized. And so I think the answer to the question is I don't really think of gender. I think of person and situation. And then this was what I started to digress to. Have you read Ted Chiang's Exhalation?
Yes.
You know what? That robot is taking himself apart, or herself. I guess it's a him. But see, that's where we are. They're not going to have gender unless we just decide, well, we need, you see what I mean? Gender.
I do.
But I loved that robot. I loved that robot. And now then, look at the world we're in now. We don't have, what, do we have a gender? We have a field of gender.
We do.
You know?
A continuum.
And now we're going to have cyborgs. What are we going to do then? You know, the world we're going into, I'm not ready to write about, but I'm ready to read, you know, and find a way into it.
I think you are writing about it. I think you do write about the world we're going into.
I guess so. I guess I am. I'm just so taken with, and in fact, you know, George Sanders, that I read, what was it I read of his? In the New Yorker, I had one of his stories, Gould.
Oh, yes. The recent one. Yeah.
Well, I thought, my goodness, you know, that's an extrapolation of reality shows and theme parks. And one in Pastoralia,
Yeah.
one of his stories, that's exactly what it is. People are portraying human life in different areas. They're not living it, they're portraying it. Somebody's living somewhere. But I thought that's where we're headed. You know, it's not, we're not going to have very much realism. We're going to have these reality and somebody's going to be controlling it electronically. So maybe I am there, Valerie, and it scares me.
I think you are. This has been delightful. I have, of course, more questions, but we have run out of time. Thank you.
Well, I love this opportunity and I love your questions. And I'm very grateful, as you know, to the press, to you, to the creative writers, Catherine, to you, Steffi, everybody. I'm just so grateful. When this all started in January and then the pandemic came, I thought I would never make it to see the birth of that book. My goal has been to live till that book got published. And I have, and it's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
So God bless us all.
Right.
Well, I want to thank you, Rosemarie, for participating and being here today and speaking with us. And also, I want to thank you, Valerie, for leading such a fascinating discussion. Thank you both for your insight. And thank you, Rosemarie, for your beautiful book, A Common Person and Other Stories. It's available wherever books are sold. And during the pandemic, we encourage you to visit and support your local bookstore, independent bookstore, either in person or online. Or you can order the book through our website at undpress.nd.edu. Thanks again. Take care.
Thank you.